I'm Soledad O'Brien. Welcome to Matter of Fact. More than 150 years after the 13th Amendment legally abolished slavery in America, it is still thriving in the form of human trafficking. It's hard to pinpoint an exact number because it often happens under the radar, but it is estimated that 20 to 40 million people worldwide are enslaved and exploited through sex and labor trafficking. In America, places like New York, LA, and Atlanta have high rates of human trafficking. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, in 2016, reported cases in the U.S. increased more than 35%. One of the most famous American abolitionists of the 19th century was Frederick Douglass. The former slave was born in Maryland 200 years ago this month. He was a famous orator, author, and confidant of Abraham Lincoln. Douglass's descendants say if he were alive today, he would be at the forefront of the fight to end human trafficking. His great-great-great-grandson is Kenneth Morris Jr., and he's the president and founder of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative. It's so nice to have you with us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Why sex trafficking as a civil rights issue to focus this family legacy, which is so powerful on? There's so many civil rights issues that I would think that you could pick.
In 2005, I came across a National Geographic magazine cover story entitled 21st Century Slaves. And when I looked at that headline, I reacted the way I think most people do the first time they hear about the existence of human trafficking. And I thought it had ended with the work of Frederick Douglass and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But as I started to research the issue, I found that slavery still existed everywhere around the world, including right here in the United States. When I looked at the legacy of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist, and then my great-great-grandfather, Booker T. Washington, as the great educator, if we combined their legacies, abolition through education, both of my ancestors understood from a very young age that education would be their pathway to freedom. And of course, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write, so they had to steal their education. So it was natural that we would go about trying to eradicate slavery today with education being at the foundation of the work.
I want to talk about education in just a moment, but first I'm really interested in talking about the international problem. There are plenty of people who think human trafficking or sex trafficking is not an American problem, but it is an American problem.
It's absolutely an American problem. Sex trafficking is an American problem as well as labor trafficking. And so we have young children that are forced into prostitution and forced into labor. And when you look at slavery today, there are many parallels to historic slavery. And when you boil down the basic elements of contemporary forms of slavery and historic slavery, it's about profit. It's about exploiting the most vulnerable among us. And we believe that we can reduce the vulnerability of young people to being trafficked by educating them on the signs and really unfitting them to be vulnerable to be enslaved.
There is legislation that was passed with bipartisan support in 2017. It's called the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act. What does that legislation do, and do you think it goes far enough?
That was legislation that really guided the way the federal government addressed human trafficking internationally and domestically. The way human trafficking has been addressed over the past 20, 25 years is reactionary. It's reacting after the crime has been committed. It's reacting after the victimization has occurred. But if we don't start to put a little bit of effort toward prevention and preventing new victims from being spit into a cycle of exploitation that just churns, if we're just rescuing, restoring, and rehabilitating, as well-meaning as we are, we're complicit in allowing that cycle of exploitation to continue.
The statistics are terrible. 1 in 6 runaways are likely to be sex trafficked.
This is why it's important to have education in the classroom. Most people, when they hear about education around human trafficking, it's educating the public on the existence of human trafficking.
How to recognize people who might be trafficked.
We're talking about institutionalized knowledge in the classroom, and the natural question that we've always heard from students is, now that we know about historic slavery and contemporary slavery, what can we do about it? How can we become modern-day abolitionists?
Why not focus on those who use sex trafficked girls and boys? You know, because often you see, if in the best case scenarios, the actual traffickers are caught, but the people who exploit, who literally are the ones who are exploiting the young people, never really get punished. Partly they're hard to track down, but there's very little legislation as well to punish them.
Well, there are buyers and there are organizations that focus on reducing demand. Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And while organizations are doing great work to repair broken men, we believe that if we can not only talk to young kids about how to prevent them from being trafficked, but also talk to young boys about their attitudes and towards women and girls, and will they become a part of the problem or will they become a part of the solution? So by building strong children, we can reduce demand long term and make sure that our kids are protected, engaged, and enlightened and educated.
Ken Morris is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Thank you for coming to talk to us.
Thank you.
You bet.